Good afternoon. As the program indicates, the session that we are now engaged in addresses both megacities and shrinking cities. And in my capacity, I will be addressing both the importance and the relevance of shrinking cities and the relationships to their respective regions. And in a nod to Myra Norfield, a lot of the work that he has done early on was the basis of what I'll be discussing as it relates to cities, specifically Youngstown, Ohio, but also applicable to cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Flint, Michigan. Also in a nod, I am a current politician and not a law professor, so I'm not sure what that means in terms of my length here, but I will certainly begin that. Just to give you a context, I'm just starting with a short video clip of the city of Youngstown and the process of transformation that we are undergoing now, and how that transformation of a shrinking city that was once projected to exceed 250,000 people remains relevant not only to its region but to other parts of the country.
We make steel and talk steel.
We got caught in a historic economic shift.
Youngstown reached a point where it almost bottomed out. What has happened since that time is that you now have the first generation that doesn't remember the days of the steel mills.
For the last 30 years, Ohio, the Mahoning Valley have been portrayed as Rust Belt communities. It's the same story over and over and over. They really haven't scratched the surface, and they don't dig deep.
People who want to really talk about the real accurate story of Youngstown have to tell the story about a community that's evolving, that's redefining itself.
And I think that most people can say that what we've been doing here for years doesn't work.
The final chapter on this community has yet to be written. As Youngstown goes, so goes the region.
Let's not bemoan what we've lost. Let's recognize what we had that made us special and unique. Let's build on those opportunities for the next generation and the future.
It is a war. Youngstown is a war in the sense that we are going to lose battles and we are going to win battles. But as long as we win more battles than we lose, we win the war.
The statement that was made that as Youngstown goes, so goes the region, I think is also relevant because as the region goes, so goes the state, and as the state of Ohio goes, as it's often been said both politically and otherwise, so goes the condition of this country in so many respects. It was John F. Kennedy who said that we will neglect our cities at our peril, because when we neglect those cities, we neglect the nation. And these central cities, although declining in population and declining in their economic prowess, still play a very important and relevant role to their respective states and to the countries. Youngstown, Ohio, as you have seen, was a city that was based primarily in its past on one industry. In 1951, the city of Youngstown's last plan was done, and at that point, the city's population exceeded 170,000 and was projected to exceed 250,000 at its peak. The steel mills were going, the economy was strong, it was the third largest steel producing region in the entire country. In 1974, as the middle plan shows, that plan was updated, and some of us are saying that there was perhaps a subliminal message in the graphics of that plan, because maybe the planners knew something that the rest of us didn't, because it was shortly thereafter, just 3 years thereafter, in 1977, when the steel mill collapsed, and the city of Youngstown lost 40,000 high-paying manufacturing jobs in the next 3 to 4 years. And it was during that period that the precipitous decline in population and the social and economic decay really set in. And it wasn't until basically 2000 through 2002 when there was a community-wide epiphany that recognized that Youngstown had to redefine itself. It still remained relevant to the region, although a significant amount of sprawl and suburbanization had occurred. Youngstown still remained relative to the region, but in order to do that, it had to go through the process of redefining itself. There you see the population decline just between 1950 and 2000, a 51% population decline, a 20% decline in the dwelling units, which is still posing a challenge, but an increase in vacant land of 12%. And again, over 30,000 jobs were lost, probably in less than a decade, just during that period of economic collapse. We started embarking on a vision and a plan of redefining what Youngstown was about. It was necessary because the city had found itself without a plan and stuck in the vision or the image of what it was some 50 years ago. A growing city, a city of 180,000 or 170,000 that was expected to exceed or approach 250,000 had it been fully developed. And the plan and everything that we operated off of was for a city that was growing, but in reality was actually declining. After a series of community meetings, there was a convening of over 1,300 citizens of both the central city and the surrounding region. And there were 4 basic principles that we came up with that to this day are defining how we are engaging ourselves as a shrinking city, but a very relevant city. And this is a lesson that is being transferred to other cities, not only across the United States, but as we found out, across other parts of the world. The 4 basic principles were, first and foremost, accepting that we are a smaller city. Now, this was something that was evident from the population numbers, but it wasn't something that was emotionally or psychologically accepted by the residents, the constituents of the city, or the governing bodies of the city. Redefining Youngstown's role in the new regional and global economy. A one-industry town was great when that industry was great, but the lack of diversification in the economic base posed to be nearly fatal to the existence of Youngstown, and understanding that Youngstown had to play a role in the regional economy and also the global economy was one of the fundamental aspects that we have shifted to and are in the process of shifting to. At its core, this was about a land use and economic plan, but we also understood in order to galvanize and keep this relevant that we had to deal with some of the issues and the image and quality of life issues of Youngstown, Ohio, specifically as it related to being a shrinking city. And the 4th principle was this had to be a call to action. It wasn't going to be something that was going to be accepted simply by having a fancy plan and having consultants come in and saying, this is what's wrong with Youngstown. There was this notion of the people of Youngstown that were waiting for the future, waiting for some external force to come in and help redefine the city. And there had to be a shift to the understanding that the ownership of making Youngstown a smaller but not an inferior city was going to be largely started by the people in the city of Youngstown. For the sake of brevity, I've taken out or selected a couple of those slides, I think, of each of those 4 categories that gives a sense of what's being accomplished in Youngstown, Ohio. Making those difficult choices of accepting that we're a smaller city certainly brings us to neighborhood-level planning and understanding which part of the city is sustainable and not choosing winners or losers, but understanding that in an environment of limited resources, that difficult decisions have to be made. There were many references to the political decisions that had to be made. Well, ignoring those political decisions certainly only exacerbates the situation. Understanding and, again, categorizing neighborhoods. When you have issues of neighborhoods that have been invested in, neighborhoods that have seen a significant amount of disinvestment that still house residents and constituents, not defining those residents or those constituents as inferior to other parts of the city, but making sure that everyone is understanding the realistic and pragmatic decisions and approaches that have to be undertaken. Identifying areas for investment where that investment can be multiplied and leveraged, and deciding what to do and how to deal with the immense amount of brownfield and abandonment that permeated the city. Defining Youngstown's role in the new regional and global economy. Again, having a one-industry town proved to be nearly fatal for the city of Youngstown, and although steel is still being manufactured in the United States and to a certain extent still in Youngstown, it is not to the extent where it has sustained the economy. To that end, we have sought to diversify the economy, but continue to build on some of those past successes and some of those past assets that we had when we were once a larger city. The first up on the top picture shows a former brownfield site that was contaminated, that was of no use after the collapse of one of the steel manufacturers that had located there, that has over the years been remediated and turned into one of the city's most productive industrial parks. And instead of one steel manufacturer there employing 3,000 or 4,000, there are probably 3 to 4 dozen businesses there that collectively employ about 1,500 people. And we've seen a significant amount of investment, but the key here is that even in this economic decline, these industrial parks are able to weather these economic storms because of the diversity of the businesses located there. On the second slide is something that is exceptionally exciting because that is a former brownfield site that, because of the regional cooperation between two cities, and that regional cooperation is something that at least in Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley area was virtually non-existent. In fact, when Marilyn Orford talked about the sprawl and talked about the segregation, that's something that's very prevalent in the Mahoning Valley. But because of the cooperation between these two cities, that is the site that was announced about 30 days ago of the single largest manufacturing investment in the country at this point, certainly in Ohio and in the country. An international seamless pipe manufacturer is going to be investing $650 million in that former brownfield site to create a state-of-the-art manufacturing to double the size of a plant that exists in the city of Youngstown, and actually will be the worldwide headquarters of that operation for exploration in the oil and gas industry. But again, it's a site that, but for the cooperation, the regional cooperation of these two cities, Youngstown being a city of about 75 to 80,000, Girard being a city of about 11,000, that remain relevant to the region, we now have the prospect of this multi-hundred-million-dollar investment. Understanding that there are still old line economies in Youngstown, such as the steel mill that I just talked about, even though it's going to be a state-of-the-art facility, what we've also sought to do in this shrinking city is to redefine the economy of Youngstown based on the new global economy. These firms are firms engaged in biotechnology and information technology and the bioscience researches that have their headquarters in downtown Youngstown and in Youngstown business incubators. As a matter of fact, the fastest growing privately held business-to-business technology firm, Turning Technologies, a couple of years ago, has its world headquarters in downtown Youngstown. So these new economies are becoming as a vitally important part of the, not only the economy of the city of Youngstown, but the economy of the region and the economy of the state of Ohio, as the manufacturing lines were before. And again, it shows that even in the midst of a declining population, these are things that help to keep Youngstown relevant. These are also the firms that are seeking to locate next to the university, into the central business district, into the technology cluster that is being created, because they see themselves and they need to have the skill sets that are being produced by the students, or that are being acquired by the students coming out of Youngstown State University. Also a part of defining the city of Youngstown and redefining its role in a regional and global economy. It was in August of 2009 that Entrepreneur magazine named Youngstown, Ohio, as one of the top 10 cities in the country to start a business. Now, Youngstown, like Flint, and like Gary, Indiana, like Detroit, like Cleveland, has been on a lot of lists. And many of those lists are less than desirable. And it's not typical that we'd find ourselves on a list with Austin, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada, and Phoenix, Arizona, and San Diego, and Portland. But again, the entrepreneurial spirit that is being developed as a part of a city that, again, is no longer defining itself by one industry and is no longer, at least locally, defining its success or failures solely by the number of inhabitants, but instead by other indicators that make it relevant to what's going on in the rest of the world and the rest of the economy. Again, at its core, this was a land use and an economic plan, but we also knew that in terms of redefining what this city was about, whether it's Youngstown, whether it's Detroit, whether it's Gary, Indiana, whether it's any of these other cities that are suffering this same fate, we had to build on some of the assets that we had as a former city. You know, there's a lot of debate and discussion as it relates to the suburbanization of this country, but I find it ironic that as we've seen this sprawl, you know, these suburban areas are seeking, or exurban areas are seeking to create these lifestyle communities. They'll take a green field or a patch of desert, and they'll create streets and you know, you can live, you can work, you can play all in one area, and they'll say, come and this is where you want to move. And our response is, well, you know, we have those. They're called downtowns. They're called cities. That was the original design and the original intent. So for these cities to, again, capitalize on these authentic urban environments is something that we've taken the approach of continuing to make, even in a smaller scale, cities of Youngstown and so many of those other cities very relevant. Understanding that, again, this has to happen at a neighborhood level. The planning that we are doing and undertaking now as a smaller city is significantly different from the planning that we did when we were a city expected to exceed 200,000. But it still involves some of the same basic principles, but what also involves is continuing to connect us to the region, developing those neighborhoods of choice, making sure that, again, the quality of life that can be offered in an urban environment isn't identical to the quality of life that might be offered in a suburban environment, but is competitive and is something that people seek to choose. And finally, a call to action, understanding that for the city of Youngstown, and I think this is relevant for other areas that we've seen, there was a paralysis, not understanding how to redefine a city like Detroit, that was for so many years and so many decades known as the Motor City and known for the prowess in terms of manufacturing, particularly in the automobile industry. That those notions of changing those cities are going to have to be as much internal as they are external. And again, the final, next to the final slide is as we've done this, there's a great deal of cynicism and wariness as it relates to our ability to redefine these cities. And that's where we talk about getting that low-hanging fruit, that a city like Youngstown does have a great deal of successes. And those successes need to be celebrated amongst the constituents of Youngstown to continue to build that motivation and that momentum to move these things forward. And what we found is that, as I started off by saying, that this phenomenon of a shrinking city, sometimes we feel as if it's only happening in our little corner of the world, but it's something that is happening not only across the country, but across the globe. There are regions of China and other areas and other countries that we travel to that have the same phenomenon. They have, I've used the term post-industrial, but I'll start using the regional urbanization in the city region as part of my new lexicon. But this is relevant, and some of the attention that's been focused on this by national and international publications have caused us to recognize that the lessons here in a shrinking city like Youngstown or so many others that have been named are absolutely relevant as we talk about urban agriculture and urban aquaculture and so many other things when it comes to land use planning. So that being the case, as we've talked about the megacities, and there are certainly lessons to be learned there, I go back to the quote of neglecting the cities of this area certainly is neglectful to the country, and as also pointed out by Myron Orfield, that we do have an administration that I believe is sensitive to and understands the importance and the relevance of these cities, not just the cities that are growing and expanding, but the cities like Detroit, like Youngstown, like Flint, like Cleveland, like so many others that at one point were the backbone of this country in terms of its wealth creation and the historical and cultural institutions of this country that, in our opinion, still remain a very important part of the future of urbanism. Thank you.